All right, so most of you guys have some semblance of the challenge done. If you didn't make it quite all the way through, that's fine. So I'm going to walk through it really quick, just to 100% concrete so everyone gets the same message of kind of what the actual goal was. And to help ease your pain a little bit if you were a little confused by it. There is an explanation of part of why it's very confusing. So first off, it has you create the clock that was created in the slides and pretty much the same thing that we created earlier. So let's start with that. One thing that I might have forgot to mention, whenever I'm building a new component, I always build it in the simplest fashion possible. Simplest fashion being just a render method. And then returning something simple as well. For this, I know it's going to be an H1, so I'll just return an H1. And then I'll just put some placeholder text. Clock goes here. And like anything in coding, small chunks. The smallest chunks you can build and test it. Especially in React, just building a component and getting it to show up on the screen is kind of complex, especially in the beginning. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that can go wrong. So starting here is always your best bet. To this day, whenever I'm starting a new component in a real project, I will build it like this first. And when and I do this with everything I code in. Even like if I'm building endpoints on API endpoints on a server, I will make the most simplest version of that endpoint first. Make sure that I'm receiving the data that I expect, and then make sure I can send just some random data back, just to make sure that the front end and back end everybody's communicating. So it's not just a philosophy for here in React, but it's just in general good practice. Start simple. Make sure all the basic things are communicating that need to. So anyways, with that said, simple version of the clock. And then I take it over to app, import it. Put it somewhere where I know it's going to show up. Sometimes you're building a component and you might not have where it's actually going to be used built yet. It's okay. You can temporarily throw it somewhere else. It's really easy to delete again. But just to test stuff, you can throw it really anywhere just to like, hey, is this working the way I expect it to? Okay, so right away, I know my component is rendering. So anything else that goes wrong, it's something in that file. It's working up to this point. All right, and then it wants you to store a date object in state, and then create a tick function to update that date object. So the first thing I'll do is create my state. I'll do it the long way first. And since we do add the constructor, I know this is a huge point of confusion, but since we did add the constructor, we do now got to capture the props and pass it to the parent. Once again, if you don't use the constructor, that will happen automatically because there's no constructor here to intercept the props being passed to the parent. But as soon as we define the constructor here, we are interfering, we're intercepting anything that was passed when the clock was created. All right, then I'll create my state. And I'm going to initially create it the same way that it was created in the slides. To local time string. I'm going to make sure I can see the time. The time is curly brackets, this dot state. Oh my gosh, it does that all the time. All right. And then once again, I'm going to test it. Before I even try and get it to update the time, I want to make sure that, am I even displaying the time initially? Okay. Have what I've built so far does all this work. Okay. I can see the time. Beautiful. So now I want to make my tick method. Okay, so this dot set state. Set state is a method that we call. I haven't seen any of you do it yet, but someone's going to do it eventually, if not all of you. I've even done it a couple times. You'll do this dot set state equals an object. I don't know why. I don't know. I don't know what causes it. I see people do this all the time. And like I said, I've even done it a couple times. And I allegedly know what I'm doing. Maybe. Lies. All lies. All right, but set state is a method. All right, and then we want to change the time property. And we'll set it to a new date object and get the time string. All right, so I've added code, but I haven't added code that's going to change anything because we're never calling tick anywhere quite yet. But just to make sure I don't have any errors in my code, I can still test it. Just make sure I didn't screw up any curly brackets or do anything weird. And then the next thing I need to do is I want to start the clock ticking. So I need to call set interval somewhere to get it to call tick every 1 second. And then this is where we use the lifecycle method. Okay? Because we need to call set interval one time, and then set interval will handle calling it every 1 second. If we tried to call set interval from render, you'd get a runaway exponential growth issue going on. Because every time render is called, you would call set interval, which in turn would call set state every 1 second. But then every time you call set state, render is called again. So then you'd be setting new intervals each time, and it would escalate very quickly out of control. So you can't call set state from the render method. Okay? Even if it's another, like I can't even call tick from the render method because tick is calling set state. You end up with an infinite loop. Because whenever set state is called, render is then called afterwards. One other thing I forgot to point out earlier too, set state is asynchronous. If you try and console log your state right after it to see that it got set, you're not going to get accurate information. Okay, so do not call set state and then try and console log the state right after it. Sometimes it does work, but most of the time it's wrong. Because React actually decides when it's going to update the state. It kind of batches all the changes together and does them all at once. It's more efficient that way. Now, when I say, it batches them all together and does them all at once, it doesn't wait like seconds to do this. It waits, 10, 20 milliseconds, which in code time is an eternity to wait. But it's imperceptible to us. We can't even know that it's waiting. But it's enough of a pause that if you put a console log right after set state, you're going to get inaccurate information. If you ever want to know what the actual values are of your state and or your props, always console log them in the render method. Okay? If you want to know the most up-to-date version of state, console log state in the render method. Even if you're changing it somewhere else, most accurate stuff is going to be in render. All right, so with all that said, we need our lifecycle method to get our clock running. So we're going to say component did mount. And then we'll use a set interval. And then because I'm only calling tick one time, I'm just going to say this dot tick dot bind this. And I'm going to call it every 1 second. If you did one of the other binding methods to bind tick, you wrapped in a fat arrow function, that's fine. Find this, you did the fat arrow property thing here, also okay. Any way you did it is fine. Okay? As long as you got it to work, you bound it in some way so you were able to address that problem. All right, so this should start our clock ticking. Okay, so that was kind of the first part. The next part is where I think I lost everybody, and it's where I lose everybody every class. Kind of. At one point, I was going to change it, but I think it's a good exercise. So don't worry, the next class will be punished with it too. All right. So what it tells you to do next is it tells you to create a time.js component. So create a new file, time.js. It tells you to create a functional component. So import React from React. And then a functional component, export default. And then it essentially tells you to return a formatted time. So I want to return a div, and inside of it, a formatted time. Now, in the instructions, it tells you that it should accept a date object. So you should be passing the time component a date object. So I'm going to assume that I'm going to be passed a date object on time. Okay, you could have called your prop anything though. I'm just going to use time. You could have used date. You could have used fluffy bunnies. Doesn't really matter. I haven't actually utilized my time component yet, so I haven't decided what I'm going to call it. I'm deciding what I'm going to call it right now. I'm going to use time. And then I'm going to say to locale time string, something along those lines. All right. To locale time string. To locale time string. Yeah. All right. So now the time component is taking a date object and then formatting it for me by calling that method and then, returning the actual time. So now over in clock, I need to make a couple changes. First thing is I need to import time from this directory time. And I don't want to format it on this end anymore. Okay, I want to just store the date object itself. So also when I update it, I just want an updated date object. I'm not formatting it here. Okay, and then instead of directly putting this dot time right here, or this dot state dot time, I'm going to use my time component. And then because here I said props.time, expecting props.time to be a date object, I'm going to say time. I guess that's a little confusing. But there's nothing against doing that. Your prop names could be the exact same as the component name. Doesn't really matter other than just confusion. This dot state. Oh, we got a lot of times everywhere. Okay, so now we're passing the date object that's stored in the state into the component via the time prop. Inside of time, we are getting access to that data object and then calling the method that actually formats it into something that's human readable. So if I save that, that works. However, I didn't necessarily want the time on a different row than my text. Why is that happening? Because I wrapped it in a div. Also, one thing to always remember in React, all of this is turning back into real HTML. And then we have an H1 with a div inside of it. Is that proper HTML structure? Even if you just had to guess, does that sound okay to you? No. It's not really. I mean, obviously, it's not yelling at us about it because HTML is, criminally helpful. But really, a div doesn't belong inside of an H1. And not to say people don't do it, but it's really not properly formatted HTML to do that. And with React, it's real easy to make that kind of mistake. So you got to kind of be on the lookout for it. So a div isn't what I want. What other element could I have used? Span. Very good. So I could have wrapped this in a span. And now it's all on one line. And a span inside of an H1 is perfectly acceptable. There's my H1, has a span inside of it. That's the time. So this was the actual end goal. And the point of it, and we're not done, but I want to talk a little bit more about the time component. But the point of it, more than anything, was passing information into another component. Okay? That was it. This is a little bit kind of overkill. You probably wouldn't break it up into this small of a component, honestly. And I think that's some of you, kind of like, why would I do this? It seems like super worthless. It is worthless. Not gonna lie. Okay, you wouldn't break it down this far. It's just for the practice of passing information into it. I'll show you how worthless it even is. So.
How worthless is it?
How worthless is it? Actually, one benefit you could get from this is if you had a bunch of these little tiny ones, you could, use different ones to pass your data object into, and that way you could format your time differently. But, So if we wrap it in a span and put it there, who's to say that we can't just return it as a string to begin with? Why do we even need the span? So toLocalTime string returns a string, hence the name of it, toLocalTime string being the key word there. So it returns a string that is the time of when it was called. So this function just directly returns a string. Still works, no change. Now, if I'm not using JSX here, I don't need to import React from React. So it works. Okay. So technically, because of the way we're using it, it is still a functional component, but by the very thinnest of margins. Only because we're using it as a component. But because of the way React works, any function you could actually invoke by using the less than greater than signs, and it calls it, essentially. Now, that doesn't mean just start writing functions and doing weird crap with it. But when you declare a functional component, it's just a function. You're not extending anything. You're not making it part of any greater thing. It's just a function. So React just, all it cares about is when you try and call something this way, it cares of one of two things. One, Is it a class? Okay, if it's a class, I'm going to do this with it. Or if it's a function, I'm going to do this with it. It doesn't know anything else about the function. As long as it returns something valid that it could render to the DOM, like a string or other JSX, it'll work as a component. When you, if you stick to doing React for a while, this rabbit hole goes really deep. And like the way JSX really works is very mind-bendy, but it's actually really cool. It takes many months, if not a year plus, of working with it constantly before your brain will actually finally start really kind of grasping how this is all really working. Not to say you won't get decent at React in, you know, a couple months, but like the full deep understanding takes time. But one thing to remember too, all JSX is just a bunch of objects, really. It's just a fancy way for us to write a bunch of objects that ultimately get built into DOM elements. It's really not that different from even how jQuery works if you really think about it. But anyways, I digress. So that was the intended answer. And like I said, if this was, you know, like, why am I doing this? This doesn't make any sense. You were actually right in thinking that. It really doesn't make sense to use that extra small component there. But it's good practice for you. All right. Any questions on that?
Not a question so much as a comment, because I want to make sure that they're aware. The fact that it's small is not the thing that's weird about it. It's just what it's accomplishing. There are some really important components we'll run into eventually that don't have a whole lot of code in them.
Very true. Yeah, and one thing, and there's even a slide about it in either the class or the functional component slide set that talks about like knowing how small you should break components up into. And unfortunately, there's not a real answer to that. It's a lot of personal preference, and it's a lot of a project you're working on, who you're working with, and kind of what they've decided how small you should be breaking things up. The real answer, in my opinion, which again, it's just my opinion, and you can ask 5 other developers and you'll probably get 5 different answers, is it something you're going to reuse? Okay? If you're building a home page and nothing in it is reusable, you can just build a home page component. It doesn't need to really necessarily be broken up smaller than that. But very unlikely that you can build a whole page and nothing in it would be reused anywhere else. Okay? So like if your website has a bunch of forms in it, you know, building some type of form component that handles all your forms and inputs and all that stuff, you know, that should be its own component. You don't want to keep rebuilding forms from the ground up everywhere you need a form. Buttons, if you want very specific buttons that look and act a certain way, building a button component, great idea. Very small component, it's just a button, but you could add all kinds of custom styling and functionality and stuff to it. So component size can range, depends on the project, depends on the team. You'll just get better with it over time.
You might be having a little bit of deja vu as to our stance on functions as well.
Yeah.
And that's not a coincidence. Components are just functions, guys.
Fancy ones, though.
Super fancy. But functions on the left.
Any other questions from the actual students, not from the nosy professor at the back? Yes.
So when we do the time.js, we do it as function components. What if it's a class component? How can we apply it to the block.js? Can we extend to class? Or
You wouldn't do that. You would just kind of start over. You'd just extend component again, and that's a good thing to bring up too. Is like once you you make class clock that extends component, you wouldn't then necessarily extend clock to make something else from that. Every time you make a new class component, you just extend component again. So if we needed more functionality out of time, we could, do class time extends component and then renders this information. So you could make it a class component. It'd be kind of pointless here, but you could technically do it. Yes.
Can you go back to clock JS again? Sorry, I have to speak loud. Apparently, some people can't. They call me out how quiet I am. So, what is the point of putting set interval in component did mount? Can't you just put it in the constructor?
You could put it in the constructor in this case. Definitely.
Okay.
For this exact purpose, the reason I show you guys doing it in did mount here is just to show you using did mount. But honestly, for building a clock, if you're really going to build a clock, it really wouldn't make much difference where you do it. One thing, too, to remember, guys, most cases using did mount is safer because you've guaranteed that your component's already rendered. A lot of times, the stuff you're doing, it won't really matter if your component's rendered or not, but did mount is a safer bet. The other thing to consider, the difference between the constructor being called and did mount being called is hundredths of a millisecond. Like it happens faster than you can snap your fingers, then it calls constructor, render, and then did mount. Like it happens way faster than I can even say it. So a lot of times there's not necessarily any benefit to using a constructor, and it's just more appropriate to use did mount. But it would work here.
What's the point? What does that do?
What do you mean?
What this component did not do? It's just
It gets called after the first render gets called.
It's just a callback for render.
It's not really a callback. It's called after render is called the first time. But then every time render is called, it doesn't call this again. This only gets called one time after the first render happens. Because sometimes, just like with jQuery, you need to interact with some of the DOM elements or stuff like that. So you need to make sure that this has been added to the DOM before you do what you're trying to do in did mount.
But what does did not do?
It does whatever you tell it to do. It's just a function.
So what's the point of calling it when you just call it? You can just do whatever you want in render.
Because you can't. If you called this in render, it would cause an infinite loop. Because every time set state is called, render is called. So if you're directly calling set state from inside of render, it creates an infinite loop. I could show you even.
It just right. Like component did not seem superfluous to me because then can't you just do whatever you want once in the constructor?
In most cases, you really can. And like I said, there was even one called component will mount that they got rid of for that exact reason. So if you wanted to do something before the render happens, you can use the constructor. But there's instances where you want it to be after the render. This just is not one of them. So here it really doesn't matter. Other times it will matter though. Kind of the same thing of, like I said, relating it to document.ready when you tried to add a click handler to an element that didn't exist yet. You had to wait for the element to be added to the DOM before you could actually add the click handler to it. Pissed it off already. It's a slow build, so like it's like the worst kind of infinite loop. Watch it get more spastic.
Oh no.
Because every time it renders, it's resetting the interval. So, it starts doubling and exponentially screwing itself.
It's not jumping by second.
Well, no, see, that's the real cool part about it, is it doesn't actually matter how fast it's ticking. Since we're using the actual data object each time, we're not incrementing the time ourselves. We're actually asking the computer, hey, what time is it right now? So even if it changes 1,000 times in a second, it doesn't matter because it's the same second. Thank you. That was a good way to put it. And now my computer's going to pieces on me.
I'm sorry.
Refresh. Get the fan going and everything.
I'm sorry.
Shouldn't have let it run so long.
So what's the difference between did mount and will mount?
When it happens. So will mount happens before render. Did mount happens after render is called. Yeah. Well, once again, will mount is deprecated, so we can't use that anymore.
Oh, because I accidentally used will mount and
Yeah.
it works. So.
No, it works. Yeah, it still works, but it's officially deprecated. And deprecated doesn't mean it doesn't work. That just means when they do their next big version change, it's not going to work.
Oh.
It's like, hey, we're about to remove this. So yeah, you got. I said one thing that it's really tricky in the beginning is wrapping your brain around like the proper time to call set state, because if you call set state of render, you get that infinite loop going. Normally, if you call set state in render, React actually has a check for that. And if it updates too many times too fast, it will throw an error and it'll stop itself. But because we were doing this with the set interval, it kind of tricked it and then pissed my computer off. Hey, any other questions about this stuff? Good news is, obviously, or maybe not obviously, I don't know, but not the last time you're going to be dealing with class components and state, and we're going to walk through a lot more examples of it. So if you're still a little iffy, that's to be expected. Today's the first day you learned all this. Also, that's what the prototypes are for too, so you get a little practice of kind of doing it on your own. And then we'll be, pretty much every day when we're building React stuff, we'll be using, function components, class components, we'll be using the state. So you're going to get a lot of exposure to all this stuff. So on that note, you might have to go back to yesterday. Oh, no, it's on today's. Okay, so the instructions are pretty similar to what you were already using previously. If you ever need to just find the instructions, reactprototypes.com, that's the domain name, so fairly easy to remember. The first prototype has you setting up a repo that you're going to be using specifically for doing the prototypes. Okay, I don't really keep it up to date. So when you npm install, it's going to tell you it has like 9,000 vulnerabilities. It's fine for doing the prototypes. All the stuff will work as it needs to. One other thing about this repo. This is strictly for doing prototypes. It is not set up to actually build like a real website that you're going to use one day. Okay, it is literally just kind of a bare bones React setup, just enough to do the prototypes in. Okay, so do not try and use this to create a new project in. If you want to create a new project, you need to either use the React Starter repo or like the Create React app from Facebook. All right, so do not use this for anything other than the prototypes. I said it's just kind of a lighter weight version of the React Starter, and I don't keep it up to date because it doesn't really matter. Also, where did it go? I tried with most of these ones. They have like a working version of what you're going to ultimately be building. So like in the class one, you're building like a stopwatch, it's taking the clock to like a higher level. So there's a little working version of this is like your goal. And there are hints along the way. The hints are pretty much just the answer. So, you know, they're there. So if you get stuck, you know, you're not spinning your wheels for hours on end. So definitely feel free to use them. I'm not trying to scare you from using them. But don't just go through and open all the hints and just copy and paste all the code. Because, not to sound cliche, but if you do that, who are you hurting? So, yeah, you're not hurting me any. I mean, other than the fact I spent a ton of time building all this crap for you guys. But, you know, like, you're here to learn. You know, be honest with yourself. Get as far as you can with it. If you need the hint, they're there for that reason, so you can kind of get instant feedback. Also, once you're done, you know, open the hint, take a look at it, and see if, you know, you're following along properly. And then at the end of a lot of the feature sets, there's like a full example of what you're supposed to be building for that feature set. Not all of them have that, but a lot of them do. But that one even gives you a warning like, hey, you know. But it just gives you kind of like what the whole file looks like. The hints kind of give you pieces. At the end, there's the whole thing. Once again, please don't abuse it. It's there to help you guys, not to help you guys skate by, because it's not about just getting through these as fast as you can. There's no point if that's all you're going to do. You know, work through these. Think about the stuff as you're doing it. You know, play with it, tweak it a little bit. You know, your code doesn't have to match the examples exactly. You know, if you want to do it a little bit differently, by all means, do it differently. Okay? It's all about practice. Practice, practice, practice. What I want you guys to start working on over the next couple days and through the weekend, I will be seeing you guys tomorrow too. I think we have one more day this week. But in case I forget to talk about it tomorrow, through the weekend, I want you guys to do, you got to do them in order, especially because the intro one has you setting up the repo initially. So the intro, functional components, class components and state, and handling inputs and forms. Handling inputs and forms is probably the longest prototype in all of LearningFuze. It's very long. So you probably want to break that one up into a couple sessions.
Wow. Scott, what did we do to you?
It's not what you guys did, it's what other people have done to me. But it's actually building a really cool little address book thing. So there's that. All very good practice. I don't necessarily expect you guys to get all the way done with, especially through handling inputs and forms by next Monday, but just work towards that goal. Okay. You definitely over the next couple days want to get through the intro, functional components, and the class components with state. Even the class components with state is a little bit long too, so you might need to break it up a little bit. But you know, just start chipping away at them. You have a little bit of time now. You have 50 minutes. Highly recommend, especially getting through the first one, getting your repo set up. That way, if you have any problems, you can ask one of us. And then just any spare time you can glean, between now and whenever, just keep chipping away at these. These are really good practice. You should be doing these, pretty much on your own. Of course, you could ask the neighbors and stuff for help if you get stuck, or any of the instructors, but they should be kind of on your own work. Okay? It's for, once again, your own practice. And I can't stress enough how important it is. Once you have it working, start changing shit and break it. Find out what breaks what. How is all this connected together? All right, that's it. I could keep talking in circles for hours, but I'll let you guys jump on it. And if I don't see you before, see you guys tomorrow.